We appreciate you taking time out of your weekend to join us as we consider ways in which historic sites construct memory and the ways we can productively be parts of. Okay, well, try again. So, the ways historic sites construct memory and the ways we can productively be parts of conversations about how the past lives on today in the present. I'm Rowena Dasch. I'm the Executive Director of the Neill-Cochran House Museum, and I'll be the panel moderator today. Before we get started, I just want to cover off a couple items of housekeeping. First, we will be recording the panel this afternoon, so if you have friends who are unable to attend today, please let them know that we'll be sharing the recording once it's been edited. Also, if you have a question for the panel, and we certainly invite your questions, know that you will be a part of the recording. From a format standpoint, we'll each take a few minutes to describe our work. We'll respond to a few pre-prepared questions, and then we'll open the conversation to the floor to answer your questions. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who have made this weekend possible. All of the events are completely free thanks to their support. Clayton Court, St. David's Foundation, 100 Black Men of Austin, Inc., Humanities Texas, the NSCDA Texas Austin Town Committee, Artwise Travel with Barbara Newey, Kathy Brown, Marion Casey, Susan and Bob Morse, Jane Hilfer and Alec Rhodes, Joyce Statz, Judy Farrell, Suzanne Labrie, and Sue Moss. And some of you are here today, and we're so thankful for your support. Finally, a bit of a plug for tomorrow's full day of public programming. We'll have live music. Actually, Mcgill is sitting right here. He'll be playing music for us tomorrow. Artisans demonstrating crafts associated with our site and with Wheatville. And Joe Mcgill, right here, will give a presentation at 2 p.m. about his work with the Slave Dwelling Project. So now, as moderator, it is my honor to introduce my fellow panelists. While awkward to give my own bio, I'll do my best. As I said, I'm the Executive Director of the Neill-Cochran House Museum. I've been here since 2013, and it's unclear to me why I'm reading my own bio. I have a BA in art history from Princeton University and MA and PhD from UT Austin. I've been at the Neill-Cochran House Museum since 2013, and my kind of dual foci during my time here have been to expand the ways in which we engage the community, primarily through temporary exhibitions like the one you see in here right now, and through being a more of a community resource for our neighbors nearby and more farther afield. That's it. So I'm going to move on to Tara. Tara Dudley is an assistant professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research examines the contributions of African American builders and architects to the American built environment, focusing on the antebellum and Reconstruction eras in Austin and Texas, and the architectural activities of New Orleans' Gens de Couleur Libre, Free People of Color. She was the recipient of the Carter Manny Award from the Brown Foundation for Best Writing in a Dissertation, and has served as a senior architectural historian for HHM and Associates, Inc. in Austin, Texas. She's been involved in various aspects of historic preservation, historical research, and writing, and consults on projects across the nation. She's the author of Building Antebellum New Orleans, Free People of Color and Their Influence, from UT Press 2021, and a forthcoming biography on African American architect John Saunders Chase. A native of Lafayette, Louisiana, who now calls the Austin area home, Dr. Dudley obtained her doctorate in architectural history and a master's degree in historic preservation from UT Austin, and holds a bachelor's degree in art history from Princeton University. Mel Gottlieb works in multiple media to re-examine her coming of age, white and female, in the Jim Crow South. Her ongoing project, Nostos Algos, considers the pain of returning to the South after a long absence, while confronting the racist mythologies and complicated legacies of the region. Gottlieb recently completed the block program of the Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and she's studied with many artists and craft practitioners in the US and in Europe. She's shown her work in national, regional, and local juried shows, and has 2 works in the Hobby Airport collection. She serves as past president of Clay Houston, has been on the board of the Visual Arts Alliance, and is a member of the Texas Sculpture Group. She holds a BA and MA in psychology from Emory University and a PhD in sociology from Boston University. She's Professor Emeritus of Public Health Education at the University of Texas at Austin, where she taught from 1980 to 2011. A native of Alabama, she moved to Texas in 1920, and it is her work that is on view here in this exhibition, Reveal and Restore Difficult History Through Art. Joseph, Joseph Mcgill Jr. is a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and the founder and director of the Slave Dwelling Project. Previously, as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Mr. Mcgill worked to revitalize the Sweet Auburn Commercial District in Atlanta, Georgia, and to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. He's a former executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a former director of history and culture at Penn Center, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. He has also served as a National Park Service park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston. For my part, I just want to spend a few minutes orienting you to where you are today, both physically here at the site and also contextually along our path toward a more inclusive site narrative. The site was first developed in 1855 to 1856 by Abner Cook, the only residential builder of any note in Austin in the late antebellum periods. The property's owners were a young couple named Washington and Mary Hill. They were 30 years old and had a 1-year-old child when they took on this project. As you see from the exterior of the building, the main house and the slave quarters both are built of limestone rubble, which was an inexpensive building material at the time, more frequently used for commercial than for fine residential structures. However, the Hills were on a budget from the beginning. Over the course of construction, it became clear to them that they had exceeded their means. The Hills sold 5 enslaved people to finance the project, which means that these buildings were not only built through labor and expert artisanship of enslaved people, but through the commodity of enslavement as well. The site's first 20 years were chaotic, as it was a rental. The first occupants were teachers and students for the State School for the Blind. We also played host to Lieutenant Governor during the Civil War, federal soldiers as a hospital at the end of the war, and then several other families for short stints prior to the Neill's purchase of the property in 1876. The name of the museum comes from the Neills and Cochrans, who were the families who lived here longest. Thanks to the early chaotic history of the site, after the museum opened to the public in 1960, the narrative focused on Abner Cook and the Greek Revival style, and then jumped ahead to the Neill and Cochran time periods. We knew very little about the occupants from the first 20 years, so without real stories to tell, the museum focused on the people about whom more was known. And the 2-story structure behind the main house, originally storage for the museum, opened in the late 1970s as a 19th century workspace on the first floor, focused on the similarities and differences between tools then and now, and a bedroom intended to give a sense of what it would have been like in Austin when the capital moved here in 1839. The structure had long ago lost its original context, and it never occurred to anyone to think hard about how the space must have been used. So what happened? How did we get to where we are today? It's going to sound perhaps incredible to you that no one recognized the slave quarters for what it was. But when you receive a narrative and you have plenty on your plate, and this site certainly has lots of history from various different time periods to interpret, the light bulb just never went off. That changed when I was asked to speak at a material culture symposium soon after I became the director, and it sent me looking carefully at the design of the main house. There is no place to store a broom in this house, much less any other tools connected to its function. And in 1856, that meant that if all work was happening outside this building, it was happening in secondary structures built by and for the use of enslaved people. That was the moment. And that shifted the way we talked about the architecture. But we knew very little about the people who made it happen, mostly because the site was a rental and we did not know enough about anyone who spent time here, enslaved or free. It was hard to find documentation, partly because the site had no address until the 1870s. And without an address or a resident name, the census records proved elusive. Thankfully, I was able to bring a partner into this project, Dr. Tara Dudley, whose excellent work and that of her students has brought to life many, though by no means all, of the previously lost people who worked and lived here. We've worked hard and methodically through the material, which has taken time, but finally we're here today to share a much broader and more inclusive narrative, and one that we hope will grow over time through the engagement of the Austin community, who will add to what we know and will make it possible to use our site as a bridge towards a broader understanding of Austin's past and how it remains connected to the present.
Just a second. There are a few chairs I see scattered about. So one right here in the hot seat in front. There's one chair here, and I think there's one over there. I know there are people sitting in the back. So, mosey on in.
Can we not have anybody sit there?
Oh.
Because of the.
Like, it's not like anyone to sit there. I was like, okay.
You can move the chair somewhere else.
No, we can move the chair. You're looking at it like, it's like, should I not hold up a piece of paper? What? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Here we go. There's an extra chair. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna pass on to Joe.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for all that has been done here to interpret. Meaning that, once upon a time, one could come to this lovely place, architecturally significant place, and learn all about all this that's going on, that went on in the confines of these walls. But what's missing, and what's usually missing from such a narrative, is who's responsible for this? Whose label was stolen to make all of this happen? All the components of this building had something to do with slave labor. There are wooden features here. Who gave them those features? Who gave this place the beauty that so many people come here to admire? Who were the people, in those quarries, taking those stones out of those quarries and transporting it here to make it this building that it is? So, knowing that these buildings existed, knowing that the stories weren't being told associated with the people who made all of this possible, is what made me come up with the idea 12 years ago to seek out the stewards of these places and encouraging them, if they weren't doing it already, and a lot of them were not, to go beyond the narrative, go beyond what you have been doing in the past, and pull from that information, that archival information that you've been using up until this point, pull the elements of those archival material or archaeological material and genealogical material that already exist, and look at those letters that may have been written. In those letters may have been a reference to an enslaved person or enslaved people that were here. They may have committed an infraction or infractions, and they were written about. They may have been contemplating in being sold or rented out or something of that nature. Look at those that census information. Sometimes that census information would not include a name, but they were enumerated. They had to enumerate them because they paid taxes on them. And pull that information out there and make it a part of the narrative. So that's what I do with the Slave Dwelling Project. I come around these places and I help them, if you will, make them comfortable with the fact that it's okay to tell that element of the story. And once you start to tell that element of the story and you get the pushback, because you will, you gotta just keep moving forward with that part of the story.
So I had the pleasure of being with Joe Mcgill 3 weeks ago at the Wallace House in Alabama. And why I'm here today is because Rowena, thank you very much, had asked me to do an art exhibit within these walls. And so the work that's around this room and whoops.
You just need it closer.
Oh, okay, here we go. So Rowena invited me to exhibit my work here, and it was going to be in conjunction with Joe's visit, I think. And so what's around the walls here is work about, my coming of age in Birmingham, Alabama, and then reflecting on the legacy of slavery in my family. Because I had spent my summers at the Wallace House, which was the plantation house that Joe visited a couple of weeks ago. And I had grown up with the Lost Cause. And it's, it took me a number of years. I'm pretty old. It took me a number of years, and over the past decade, I've really been trying to reckon with what that meant, and I've reckoned with it through art. And so I would invite you to look at the work around the room, and then embedded in each of the rooms, there's some other objects. And then upstairs, there is a display of more posters that talk about the organization that we founded. So here's the quick story. You can read about it upstairs. In 2018, I unexpectedly inherited this family house from a cousin. And I hadn't wanted it. He told me he was going to give it to his ex-wife if I didn't take it. And so I took it. And from that moment, I had to think about, what were we going to do with it? And so, there we go.
Better.
Sorry.
Please hold it.
Okay, right. I'm not a singer-talker. So in 2018, I inherited it and started thinking about what to do, wanted to be intentional about it. And I got together with the co-founder of Klein Arts Culture, who is the mayor of Harpersville. He's now the fourth-term mayor of the town. He's African-American. He had grown up with our family, and I knew his grandfather and great-uncle as a child. And so we decided that what we were going to do is put an organization together for the purpose of racial reconciliation through arts and culture. And so we were able to start out being intentional. We didn't have a house. We had a house that had been empty for 50 years, and it was a wreck. And so we didn't have to undo things because we could start afresh. So our board is, I wrote down 6/8 descendants or people who were involved in another family next to the house during antebellum times. And half of the board, there are 8 board members, live in Harpersville, which is a small town. It's 35 miles outside of Birmingham in a rural area. It's still cotton growing, so there's cotton on both sides of the land. We have 6 acres of what was originally almost 5,000 acres. And the other side has a body shop and a highway full of fast trucks. So that's the story of Klein Arts and Culture, and that's the story that you will see upstairs. So the one thing I want to say about preservation is that for me, it's not just about the house, and it's not just about the furnishings, and it's not just about the architecture. In fact, it's almost not about that at all. It's because it's a place of memory for the Black Wallaces and the White Wallaces. And because it's a place for people today. It's really about today rather than the past. For people today to come together and to reckon with the past and to figure out what truthfully happened here. Because we have all the census stuff. That second panel talks about, how it all happened, right? And now what we're trying to do is to get together, to process that together, and to come out with a new narrative. And the way we're doing it is through art and culture. And so art was the path for me to try to understand my relationship to this past. And so what you see dribbled around in this house, those are all, over there are decal plates that talk about my growing up in Birmingham. And, believe it, nobody who's younger than me can believe this, but we did not know what was going on. The white kids in Birmingham had no idea the forces that lay behind the civil rights movement. I grew up in an all-white school. I went back to my 50th reunion. It was all black. And that's when it was that event, the 50th reunion, that really turned me around. And so I began to work on it, through ceramics, through, canvases. You'll see stuff all around. And working with it with my hands really led to a new understanding. There's a bowl upstairs that's got the crushed brick from the house that I found on the ground, and that had been made by the people enslaved on the place. And so I was touching that. I crushed it. I put it into clay and fired it. And, that was a moment when I sort of connected viscerally. And I think that's what these sites do, is you connect viscerally with the past. When you walk through what we call benign neglect. It's, we aren't doing anything to the house other than to get it safe, get it preserved, and then have it be a blank canvas for people to project their thoughts onto, for performances to be in. And we're going to end up with virtual reality as a way to enter into the house. So that's my part with the art that brought me. So now we're using art and cultural activities to bring the community together. So I guess I'm going to start with our first event, was bringing together Black and White descendants in 2018. And we met in the black part of the family cemetery. There's a black part and a white part, about a mile from the house. And, we made apologies for what had happened on that spot, including all the way up to the present when my family had closed off the cemetery for the black burial and people whose families had buried there for generations. So there was a lot of stuff to undo and to begin to work on. So we've had 2 homecomings. We'll have another one in October. In 2020, we had our big art event, which you can see upstairs. There's one of the posters is about migratus ataraxia, and I'll use this as an example of art and healing. So, I'm very sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay, it just sounds like there's a lot of feedback. So in 2020, in January, a dance company, the Weidman Davis Dance Company, had been brought to Alabama by the Alabama Dance Festival for their showcase event, and they actually got closed out of the house they were going to do it in Birmingham, and they were desperately looking for a place about 6 months before, and we hadn't finished our, shoring up the house. And we turned out to be the answer. They came to us, and the choreography, it was an all-black dance company from the University of South Carolina, and the choreography was to bring a black narrative into the house to reshape turn it upside down, starting with reading the Alabama slave code as the dancers walked down, and then there was a vignette in each room, very powerful. There's a video upstairs that has some of the dance on it. But that event, catalyzed us because the people who saw that were opened up. They were broken open by it because 40 people, it was 6 nights, 40 people moved from room to room, and you were right up with the dancers and right up with what's going on. And that, confirmed for us that we were doing the right thing. That was a big event. And actually, they're coming back to the house in 2023 because they got a Mellon grant for the monument. Think about, got asked about monuments, but they got a Mellon grant to be a monument, a cultural monument, and they're coming back to Harpersville to do workshops in the community and do another dance. We're also working with the schools on persona points. All of this is upstairs. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about the frame of creative placemaking, because that's the way we consider what we're doing now. Is we're using art for community development, for bringing people together, for having facilitated discussion that goes with it. And what we're trying to do is change the house as a symbol of white supremacy, which is what it was, and change that to foreground the Black experience and Black history that is there. And and change the collective memory. So first we have to confront it, then we have to change the memory. Then we have to change the memory. And just to illustrate, my memory of it was all great. I mean, I had a wonderful time with my grandmother in the summers. Another one of our board members, Peter Datcher, tells of driving by every week to go to the other town, and his mother would say, "Now baby, this is where your ancestors were enslaved." And she said that over and over, and he came up with, this is my place, even though it's not mine now, without bitterness. But we've had another descendant who drove by it all the time too, and every time he drove by it, all he could think of was the pain that we had caused his family, and continuing through the generations in terms of closing off the cemetery and doing stuff. And when he came to the house for the first time, he had to go out. And so it is a place of memory. These historical sites are places of memory, but different memories. And so what we have to do is confront our ancestral memories, through these sites, and to extend it beyond that, so that we'll be able to shift to a new narrative, the narrative that Joe talks about. So I guess I will close by talking about the reparative historical interpretation, because it's important for it to be history. And we've been working with Elijah Gaddis, who's a professor of public history at Auburn University. And on April 2nd, when Joe was here, there was a panel discussion talking about how do you interpret enslavement in plantation houses. And it's the first of 3 panels where this group of historians is coming together to work on what a reparative interpretation of the house would be like. The Auburn students and Elijah are doing oral histories of descendants, because we have all the census stuff, we've got all the white stuff. We have information about, over there it says, the Black Wallaces who vote. I think there were 12 who voted in 1867, but we don't know the historical memory, and so that's what we're gonna do, and then work on retelling the story, and getting the story to be much different from what it is on that wall over there. So on May 1st, we're going to have Community History Harvest Day, where people bring documents and objects, and the Auburn students are going to digitize them and put metadata on it so that the digitized stuff can be archived, and then people take their stuff home. So I think the final point is just to reckon with the past with truth-telling. We've got to just ferret out what the truth is and do whatever it takes to get that truth out. And then we want to reshape our collective memories in the light of what comes up with that, so that we can create a narrative for the future. So I invite you to go look at all the art upstairs here, and I'm going to hang around afterwards if anybody wants a little mini tour or whatever.
Good afternoon. I'm super excited, please. I don't think there are enough adjectives that can describe the things I'm feeling at the moment. So thank you all for coming. I'm gonna try to keep the microphone up. I can't promise. So I'm not a singer talker either, although once upon a time I wanted to be an opera singer. But luckily for us, I pursued architecture. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about today. If you had asked me, growing up as a little Black girl in Lafayette, Louisiana, what I wanted to be when I grew up, an architectural historian would not have been what I said. I would not have known what that was. And so I think there were a series of, let's say, fortunate events that led me to this career path, including studying art history at Princeton, but I didn't want to be a curator. Ended up coming back to Louisiana, and I got a graduate internship, which I wasn't in graduate school yet, had no thoughts of going to graduate school at that point. But with my background, and I think also because I was a native of the area, had this internship at Shadows on the Teche, which is a National Trust for Historic Preservation site that was built in the 1830s in New Iberia, Louisiana. And at that site, in addition to pursuing things like writing or implementing parts of a historic furnishing report, because I was extremely interested in historic interiors, working with school groups on history, particularly high school students at a predominantly African-American high school, where they would come to the site, learn about the history of the enslavers and the enslaved at the site. There was actually a student the year that I was there who was a descendant. So that proved a really fruitful and enriching experience for me as well. And it was actually there, flipping through an issue of Preservation Magazine, which the National Trust puts out, that it was probably May during Preservation Month, when they were listing all of the undergraduate and graduate programs in historic preservation. I was like, oh, this is the thing. And so, they kind of coalesced all of these interests that I had in history, in art, in the built environment, specifically interiors at the time. And looking at various programs, arrived at the University of Texas and pursued the master's degree in historic preservation. And even at that time, wasn't sure, exactly what I was going to do with that, how would I approach that, if I was going to make that a career. Even as I started working at Hardy Heckmore at the time, now H.H. Hutton Associates, which is a preservation consulting firm that is still here in Austin and going strong. But within this community in particular, and also projects nationwide, working on different stories or projects that we're getting at stories in many cases of various marginalized communities. And also during that time, squirreling away ideas for projects or things that I wanted to learn more, because you're working for a client, you have a budget, you have a time frame, you have a money frame, and certain things that the client does or does not want that you can and cannot approach. And so, kind of just like squirreling away stories and ideas, methodologies, and being a sponge a bit. And then I decided, and thanks for some nudging of my then fiance and now husband, to pursue a doctorate in architectural history. And even at the time when it came for me to decide what I was going to write my dissertation about, I think I was going to do something on early African American architects, like early 20th century. But I'd written this paper in a class that we had, Architecture in the Age of Revolution. And I wanted to learn, did the Haitian Revolution impact any architecture in Louisiana? This goes to show what you do and do not learn in school, because I grew up in Louisiana in the public school system, but I had excellent history teachers who I think were also a great influence. And after doing, just mostly secondary source research, learning, they had a significant influence on architecture in New Orleans, throughout the state, and in other communities of free people of color, many of whom came from present-day Haiti or Saint-Domingue, others who did not. And I had a friend in the program who said, why don't you write your dissertation on this? And in writing that story, of course, I'm writing about architecture, I'm writing about physical form, the things that are tangible, but it became increasingly important for me to tell those stories of what's not on the page and who's behind these buildings, these architectures, these stories, the development of these communities and the larger built environment. And it's that approach really that has informed a lot of my work up until the present, and has really allowed me to, I think, be a good partner in crime with Rowena, who approached me in about 2016, but with workload and other things, we weren't able to really start pursuing the work on the slave quarters building at that time. And it was really my gaining a full-time teaching load in teaching a class on American architecture, and then a course that I developed at UT called African American Experiences in Architecture. And so I contacted her and I said, all right, I have a little bit more time, but more importantly, I have all of these hungry students who are just ready. And so we have, researchers and can fan out and start to pursue this project. And I have one of my students here who was among the first Tolu sitting over there. So I have to give her a shout out. And so it is then that we really started pursuing this history in earnest, learning not only about the evolution of the slave quarters building, its relationship to this building, how it fans out from the output of Abner Cook, who was a master builder at that time, but beginning to repopulate these spaces, this site and this environment with the stories of the enslaved, and beyond that in the postbellum era of several European immigrant, Swedish, German domestic servants who worked in the household, residents of Wheatville who were at the site. And this was the closest neighbor to the Neills and the Cochrans, the community of Wheatville, that freedom colony. And it made sense, well, there had to have been individuals, because most black people in Austin and in the United States at the time were in domestic service. And so it made sense to me, why didn't you start looking for names of individuals who were residents of Wheatville that might have worked at this site, and sure enough there were. And from just the little bits of information, we often use this phrase, hidden in plain sight. Well, it's really not that hidden if you start looking for it, whether it's in census records, as Joe said, and some of these, the names aren't there, but you can look at ages and start to make connections. And in there, in wanting to do this research, of course, we wanted to get it right. So it's a process, which is why we did this sort of in-process exhibit of the student work and the research that we've been starting to develop, but it gets to a point where we need to share this information with the community, also to be able to get that feedback, that input. And
But I think both Rowena and I are perfectionists in many ways, and so you think you want to get the story out there, but you don't want to tell the story because we don't want to get it wrong. You know what I'm saying? But was it yesterday that I emailed you about Lamb? And so one young man who you will hear about in our ongoing story, and particularly this weekend, is a young boy by the name of Lamb. He was enslaved by W.P. Mabin and was hired out to the Texas Blind Asylum to teach the blind students in the school how to weave baskets. So giving these students who were visually impaired some an ability to be financially independent once they would leave this place, even though he was not allowed that agency. And in thinking a little bit more about Lamb and W.P. Mabin, and I was procrastinating on some other stuff, and I was just like, I'm gonna go figure out who W.P. Mabin was. And so I just started digging and digging, and there are all these things that ultimately link together, these 6 degrees of separation really, especially in such a small place that Austin still was at that time in the late 1850s. And I figured out that W.P. Mabin owned a significant portion of the north part of what is now Camp Mabry. There was a plantation there, another site called Edgemont. There was, I can't remember the owner of that property, but that's where Lamb lived. And then thinking about Mabin, and I went back to the slave schedule in the 1860 census, and there were only 3 or 4 boys who would have been of the age that Lamb would have been. And so even though we don't have his name there, I know that one of these 2 young black boys were enslaved by Mabin at that time. And so we have found Lamb on paper, and we knew where he lived when he was not working at this site. And so beginning to make those kinds of connections, repopulate these spaces, and give the individuals who were such an important part of not only this site, the city of Austin, but in American history, their voices back, and to make those connections and really call their names, their contributions in this work. So that's how I arrived at this place in my work.
Thank you, everybody. Tara and I brainstormed a few questions that we thought would be good for us to answer, but might be questions that you all have as well. And so I'm going to pose these to our panelists, and then after that we'll open up to you all for questions. The first is, why is it important to preserve sites of enslavement? How would you respond to the argument that these places commemorate violence and forced labor, and as a result should be torn down?
Well, that's easy. Yeah, we tell these stories. We preserve these sites because if the sites aren't there, you could easily say that never happened. We've got people today who deny the Holocaust, and we certainly don't want to be like those folks. If this place should go away, places like this should go away, we would deprive people of the opportunity to feel what I felt when I went into the space in Amsterdam where Anne Frank hid from the Germans. That did something to me. That made me love history. Up to that point, history to me, but then I went into that space. Then I thought about the time I was sitting in that class and not listening as I should have been listening. But in that space, it brought it all back to me and made me realize that it was necessary that spaces like that should exist. Although the history associated with those spaces is not always positive, it's history nonetheless. History that we need to continue to interpret to our youth. Now, the folks who say, well, they should be torn down, or they say, well, they're like Confederate monuments. Well, I beg to differ. When we look at Confederate monuments, we got to look at the purpose for them being placed there in the first place, and who placed them there. If we look at the goal of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, in the fact that the South lost the war, but they won the narrative. They won the narrative in the sense that placing those monuments where they were we enforce that lost cause. Moonlight and Magnolias are in your face kind of in interpretation. So the question is whether should they have been there in the first place. So then we can go a little deeper than that. If we can defend keeping them up there, then we're going to have to include in that particular narrative, I want to know how many people that person enslaved. If you search his DNA, you're going to find somebody who looked like me. What do they do to enhance or assist the black folks of their period in pursuing their happiness? Were they for it or were they against it? We've got some examples of things that were in being interpreted. Situation in Memphis, Tennessee, where I'll be going to next month. They interpreted a site that included Nathan Bedford Forrest, who during the Civil War did great things for the Confederacy, if you were, think in military terms. But of course, after that Civil War, he was one of the founders of the KKK. Well, anyway, this particular interpretive sign talked about William Bedford Forrest, talked about his business. He was a businessman, and he was a businessman, but it didn't say what that business was. And that business was the buying and selling of people. So now they took that particular sign away, and they inserted that, what that business was. And I'm okay with that. So if you're gonna leave those monuments up there, just tell the whole story. Just as it's necessary for those slave dwellings to stay because it tells the whole story. We want to know about all this. This is magnificent, but it's not the whole story. And leaving those places there help us to tell that whole story.
Good.
Yeah. I'm just going to add to it because it had the part about a place of violence and pain, which it was, but it also erases the story of people, the enslaved people who had families, who had love, who had life, and had their own resilience on that space, and we can't erase that either.
I can answer this question in a number of ways, but I think that both Joe and Nell have spoke to it quite eloquently. And I think that, these dwellings are a way of connection in many ways. Whether you're gonna feel what you're gonna feel, and that's okay. But in order to, why are we feeling this way about a particular building, and to understand the history or histories that is all a part of that, and to understand more broadly, our American histories. We know about, the Confederate statues, and we don't know, necessarily why they're there. And what we do know about history, it's because it's, in the textbooks. But who were the organizations? Some of these women's organizations that were wanting to continue to support the lost cause and the things that their men had done or their male ancestors had done. But what about other portions of American society? And I think just making those connections, having those things that are physical and tangible that people can understand more significantly, more concretely, if you will, to understand those histories and to connect us all as Americans. Being an American is not one particular situation or circumstance, and I think that's something that the built environment and historic preservation can help to more broadly address if we are willing to open up the doors to the kinds of buildings that we consider significant with the standards that we have developed in the field of preservation and architectural history, in understanding the kinds of methodologies and having, yes, let's have our textbooks, let's have the documents that are present. I'm getting the signs in the back, I can't hear. And being able to have those different voices. What are the other ways of, means of expertise, if you will, the oral histories of various marginalized groups and things of that nature that can all come together with the buildings like slave quarters to help us understand those histories. We have a broad portion of Americans who do not know their place in this country. have that history. I'm one of those people. And for me, as an architectural historian and learning ways and methods to study the built environment have helped me to be able to do family research and family histories and make those connections, talking about Civil War ancestors, if you will. We've been able to do a significant amount of research on my husband's side of the family. And his third great grandfather was smuggled into Texas via Cuba after the international slave trade was closed, and by none other than James Fannin. And if you know your Texas history, I know, right? And making that particular connection in film is really so juicy. Yeah, so when I made that connection, I was like, ooh. But, and so wanting to dig a little bit more deeply into those stories. But, for me, that, for other people, there's pain. But for me, it's a sense of ownership, right? And just like, okay, so this is, I had a place here. Many people have had a place here, and being able to access that history through buildings like plantation houses, through slave quarters. People, I'm an architectural historian, so what can I say, but plantation houses are among my favorite buildings, just because of what we can learn from them, not physically in the design and nice furnishings, but to understand human nature in various ways and how we can expand on that history. So that's why I think these buildings are important and why they should stay.
More in the lines of advocacy in the present, how do we get more people involved or engaged in preserving, commemorating, and researching these sites, and more generally interested in learning about them? And I'll just say, just as a plug for anybody who might know someone who would be interested in this, that the Texas Historical Commission has a diversity scholars program that is really fantastic. And I think it's 6 or 7 right now. Scholars are sponsored each summer. It's been endowed, and so that support moves forward. And from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges we have is finding diverse interns. It's a real challenge when the field is not producing a very diverse group of scholars, because those are the people who will then move on to become professionals in the field and will be adding their voices. So I think programs like the Diversity Internship Program are really important, but we need more and more of that sort of thing, which begins with, in my mind, primary and secondary education and taking field trips to historic sites and the things that are such a challenge to make happen with schools right now, because it's once those kids put their feet on your property, some of those kids will ultimately grow up to be preservationists, whether they're preservationists professionally or whether they're lawyers and doctors and the people who go out and teachers and people who support sites and support history kind of as a sideline to what they do professionally.
I can take that.
Rowena's absolutely right, and I think that we need to make history relatable. And I was very fortunate that even though it wasn't necessarily my history, I was able to have teachers in grade school and beyond who made history relatable, who made it interesting. We got to do things like go on field trips to Natchez, Mississippi, to the homes there. We went on this trip called the Three Cities trip, and so we're in Philadelphia. We went to Monticello. It was 3 cities, Tara, actually it was 4. Wilmington, and now I can't remember Williamsburg. And of course I'm the kid who was asking the questions about the enslaved people, although I did ask a question at Stanton Hall, who knows the old TV miniseries North and South with Patrick Swayze. So at the time, all of our moms were like in love with Patrick Swayze. And so my friends, they want to know which room, because the interiors of that house were shot, the interior scenes for his home, his family's home. And so my friends wanted to know which room was Rory's, that was his character. But nobody wanted to go and ask the docent. So I got picked somehow to go and ask the docent. But wait. And then my dad was a chaperone on the field trip, which he never did. So of course I was on my best behavior, and I'm crossing the room, and he's looking at me like, what are you doing? And I was like, I promise it's okay. And I go up to the docent, ma'am, can you tell me which room was Rory's? And then she looked at me like I was the second coming or something. And she said, come with me. And I was like, oh gosh, what did I do? She walks over to the room. It's one of those houses where there's a velvet rope in front of the door. And I still see this like in a magical dream where she pulls back the rope and then she's like, go in. And I was like, what? And then she goes, would you like to sit on the bed? Yes. And so there's this, 4-poster bed that's about this high with a white coverlet on it, and somewhere there's a picture of me like laying down on the bed. And so it's like, ask your own questions, learn, ask questions. And so that's a lesson that I learned there. And just having those different voices, but also the representation. Most of my history teachers, all of my history teachers were white women. And not having people that looked like me, maybe I would have known that I could be an architectural historian or something like that. And it's, similar in the field of the built environment, of architects and whatnot. And so making those connections and having people that look like you, but being able to expand that even to a certain extent outside of academia. Who are our community historians, who are our community storytellers, and validating those stories, validating those voices, and what we do as academics, as professionals, is extremely important as well. And so there are, lots of levels to this, but I think, being more inclusive in those ways to gather those diverse voices is extremely important.
I want to do a shout out to Rowena. I think one of the most important things is the programming that goes on, and her exhibit and talk, and Jennifer Cumberbatch, the whole thing.
Ginger's here.
I saw Ginger earlier, and Ginger Hire with her embedded work all through it and work with it. That brought in a lot of people, and If These Walls Could Talk was a time for facilitated discussion, for thinking about what's going on. So I think the programming is key. And I think the other thing that we have, since we know our town is full of descendants, Black Wallace descendants and 2 white Wallace descendants, but the reaching out to the diaspora. And so we're going to bring our homecoming to invite people from all over the country, because the Black Wallace reunions are held all over the country and they bring people in. And so bringing people back to their place is really important to us, and that's a way to reach out. And lastly, reaching out to universities. We've had interns and all of this oral history stuff being done by university faculty, and it's been great.
Yeah, I think, you deserve credit. Look. Look at the diversity in this room. I'm willing to bet a lot of these black faces I see are visiting this place for the first time. Can you raise your hand?
Yep.
See? Check that out. See what you're doing here? This is good.
What you're doing. You're here.
This is good. That's the start. So now here's the thing. Now, in creating this interpretive plan for this space, that space out there, we need to keep those folks who just raised their hand, we need to keep them involved, our representatives of them involved in this. Now, I said that to say this. Now, some of you may be paying attention to what's going on at Montpelier. They got themselves to a place where they agreed that, we're going to do this together. We're going to give the descendants of enslaved parity on our board of directors. Well, in the last 3 weeks, they reneged. They pulled back from that. So let's not get complacent. Let's not, have these folks at the table just for them to be at the table and to check off a block on a checklist. Let's continue to keep these people engaged, and that's And then you're going to be inserting into the narrative those missing voices that have not been there and should have been there all the time.
I want to open it up to you all for anybody who has any questions, because we're being recorded. I think the easiest thing is I can repeat questions to make sure that everybody can hear them. Anybody have a question for one of us? We solved every problem?
Could you tell us where Montpelier is?
Oh, sure. You want to describe Montpelier?
Montpelier, the home of James Madison, the father of our Constitution. You know, we the people?
You mean in Vermont?
No,
Oh.
Orange, Virginia. You know, yeah, we the people. I should have read we the people, comma, in this room. Because if you weren't in that room, it meant nothing to you. Because, you know, it had that Constitution had to be amended many times to include me. And as I look at the black females in this audience, many times over, to include you. So yes, that Montpelier, the home of our President James Madison, father of our Constitution, one of 12 slave-owning presidents.
Okay. You have a question?
Oh, no, I was pointing to you.
Oh, okay. So, I visited the Whitney Plantation, which is amazing, and then more recently the Biltmore Estate, which is, I consider those kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum. And so how much progress is being made across the country in terms of trying to tell the other history, the whole story, with these sites?
So the question was, thinking about the Whitney Plantation, also thinking about the Biltmore Estate, how much progress is being made in actually telling a more inclusive narrative?
Does that one work? You completely ignored this microphone.
Turn it on.
Here.
I mean, how do we measure progress? I think I would answer your question with another question. If we're talking in terms of the faces, the age ranges that we see in this space, I would say we are making progress. If we're talking about Montpelier, there's no progress. We're like backtracking. So it really, it depends. But I think as long as we keep momentum, we keep trying. You know, we have things like this whole argument over critical race theory, AKA actual American history. I'm sorry, I hate that. We're being filmed and this is going to be out there for 5 years. But that's how I feel about it. You know, and with these arguments that we continue to have about such things, you know, that would seemingly appear as if we're not making progress. But I think as long as we continue conversations, we continue to engage with one another and be open, then we'll maintain that momentum, as I said, and not go backwards in some cases. You know, there are some shorter battles that we have to fight. We win some, we lose some. But as long as we keep on going, I think that's progress in and of itself.
You want to say anything?
Oh yes. Yeah, we certainly are making progress. You know, 12 years ago, when I started sleeping in slave dwellings, it was my intent just to stay within the state of South Carolina. That's where my limited resources would take me. So now 12 years later, and 25 states later, and the District of Columbia, you know, I've stayed in over 150 slave dwellings in those states. And so here's the progress. You know, 12 years ago, when I started this thing, I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South, and you know, justifiably so. That's what was taught to me, and I did take a Civil War and the 13th Amendment in slavery in the South. But here's what I've learned: slavery was not only a Southern thing, because if we look at those Northern states that enslaved people and ended it legislatively. We got to think about the fact that even after that, they were still complicit because they still owned the insurance companies, insuring the enslaved people, the banks holding the mortgages to these enslaved people because they were property, the ships bringing them in, and the factories adding value to the cotton that was being picked. You know, I I get a lot of pushback when I tell people what I do. Then I said 8 of the slave states, 8 of the states that I visited were northern states. And they started talking, they always lead with the Underground Railroad. They're real proud of that. And they want to talk about, the Northern Army that they sent down south to rid us of that institution. They want to talk about their Revolutionary War history. And I said, oh, that's all well and good. But I got to take you back a little further in your history. And we get the opportunity to do that. So we are making a lot of progress. Well, we gotta be on our toes. There are always those efforts to take us back. And thank you for bringing that term, CRT, anti-CRT, to this conversation. Because just before you picked me up this morning, I was on the verge of making a post. Because I just looked at the news and I looked at what's happening in Florida about math books.
Oh, yeah.
We got that on math books. How can you look at a math book and extract from that, well, we're not going to use this math book because it talks about anti-CRT, a math book. Well, if I think if you're really interested in math, then we need to figure out, well, 3/5 is a fraction. That's not a whole. 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. 25 signers of our Constitution were slave owners. 41 signers of our Declaration of Independence were slave owners. Let's consider that bad. So yeah, so we are making progress.
Add it up.
I got a two-part question. First one for Rowena and Tara. So, some of the people that are here today didn't have the benefit of hearing the interpretive rendition that Ted Eubanks did earlier. Can you specifically speak to why it is so important and what is the unique history and the unique story of the slave quarters here, and how it will help the narrative or rebalance the narrative here for Austin that many of us may not be aware of or know of? So speak to that. And then secondly, what can these, we already got the amen coming to here. Everyone's here because they support this work, but what can they do after they leave here to make sure this happens, this project happens in the next year, to make sure that the people that are not here are being told the story and being engaged? So everybody can tackle that one.
Okay, so the question was two-part. The first being about the slave quarters building and why is it that this structure holds, in our view, this special place in Austin history and value in the present. And then the second piece of that is, what is it that you all, who are all here today, who, Carl's right, it's a little bit of preaching to the choir because he knew what we were talking about before you showed up. What can you do to help us make this a reality, the work that we're going to be doing here? As far as the first piece goes, I'll let Tara talk a bit about the people who we have found, and by we, in large part, I mean she, because she's the one who did the historic furnishings report. But what I'll say from my perspective is that as somebody who is a preservationist, and I'm an art historian, but I mean, like this is all my mom's fault. Like my parents took us to historic sites on every vacation. I mean, that's all we did. All we did. And my grandmother at one point, when I said I was going to go to graduate school and that meant I wasn't actually going to go have a real career, she looked at my mother and said, "You know, this is all your fault." So I've drunk that Kool-Aid, right? And I believe that when you put your feet in the places that people came before, you can experience at least a sliver of their lives. And we are the place where you can do that in Austin. For a variety of reasons, there are not other opportunities in this city today that can connect us to the past in that visceral way. There is no other intact, visitable slave dwelling left in the city. And because of where we just happen to be, I mean, this site with its proximity to Wheatville And Ted Eubanks was saying earlier today, he was really talking about the fact that Black history in this town, city today, but town then, began on the west side. What we see today as an east side population, which I hesitate to even say that, but that is not the reality of Austin history. This was not a place that was necessarily where there was equitable treatment for all people, but there was integration. And people lived side by side, and the city functioned in many ways, and in most ways, depending on how you look at it, because of the efforts of the enslaved and then free people of color who were here. So this place matters because this is the place where you can put your feet and you can look out at the rest of our city and you can understand at least a piece of how we ended up in this place where we are today as a city.
And not only can we understand that piece, but you can understand almost every aspect of Austin's history here in this site in a very interesting way. Rowena and I have begun to express that this site, the Slave Quarters building, is in many ways a fulcrum to all of these stories of, or aspects or components of Austin history, from Edwin Waller, who did not actually plat and survey the city. It was the group of individuals, free, enslaved, white, black, that he gathered with him on his way to Austin. Men like Mac, Adam, and Ned, who were hired out from their enslavers to make our streets, to develop the city of Austin and its beginning days, and construct the log cabins that served as the early places or sites of our government. Men like Abner Cook, who used the labor of enslaved persons and who the Hills, mortgaged off in order to try to maintain this property, and getting at those stories and those names over time, understanding that in this very unique relationship, an ability we have to learn about slavery. Everybody understands rural enslavement, and you think of a plantation, you think of a big white building with nice classical columns and all these acres of sugarcane or cotton if we're talking about Texas. But there are differences of urban slavery, and beginning to understand what that was like in a place like Austin or Houston or Galveston, even in the antebellum era. And this site, we have the only intact slave building left in Austin. There would have been other buildings like this in this city. There is a house on West 11th, but it reads as a single family home in the way that it's changed over time. You've probably driven past it a number of times, not knowing that that building was a place where enslaved people dwelled. That the owner of that site actually was a person who hired out an enslaved girl to the Texas Blind Asylum to work here during those years. And so understanding that aspect to this history, and then moving forward in the postbellum era, understanding the relationships between this site, other parts of Austin, as they're related to the freedom colonies that began to develop throughout the city, Wheatville being among one of the first here on the west side. And then moving forward, we understand East Austin and that being an enclave of the Black community as a result of the 1928 city plan. So you have that part of the history that is grounded in many ways here at this site. Moving forward, the development of the University of Texas that is also complicit in the displacement of African Americans. Don't make me go to church. I think I'm already there. But understanding the development of this area and the movement of those people and their voices. And we think, that in 1928, all the Black people went over to East Austin. Not so. There are families who held on and lived in this area through the 1940s, through the 1950s, and beyond. And so understanding that aspect of the history, and then right up to the present day, students who, when we were sitting outside earlier, walking by, and some of them with their parents, not understanding or knowing what this site is, because they see that the facade of the Greek Revival building with the classical columns. People have said that they thought this was a law office or other things. That's right, frat house, because there are a number of fraternities and sororities in this area. There have been since the early 20th century by virtue of the proximity to and relationship with the university. There were even at one time members of a sorority. This wasn't their sorority house, but they were boarders here in the home as well, and other students as well. And so, you know, the significance that this particular site brings to so many other places, you know, and I've taken us to church a little bit, but, you know, basically what you guys can do is go tell it on the mountain, you know, talk about this with your neighbors, talk about it in your classrooms, with your fellow classmates at church, you know, and tell people about this site. Hey, I went to this place and you can learn about all this Austin history here, all this Black history here, and really get people to understand that this is not just a place for one narrative, one story, that we have so many ways that we can reach out to help enrich and reckon with Austin's past here at this particular site.
I was just wondering if you've had any negative feedback to what you're trying to do here in terms of the legacy and changing the narrative.
Sure. So the question is, has there been any negative feedback in what we're doing and how we're doing it? So we have not seen a great deal of negative feedback. There, every so often, is somebody who comes here who says, I'm not here to hear this. Every so often. I mean, I'd say it happens maybe once every 18 months to 2 years. I mean, it is a rare occurrence, but that has happened from time to time. My biggest concern at this point is, and we have been very deliberate and slow about how we have done what we have done, because as Tara pointed out, we are perfectionists and we don't want to get this wrong. You don't want facts out there that we are expressing as facts that we then have to walk back because we found out we're wrong. So this has been a process, and it's been a process of building credibility. I mean, if you look at the front of our house, we look like something pulled out of Gone with the Wind, right? I mean, we were not a plantation. We were never large enough for that. It was 17.5 acres, so commercial farming was really not a thing here. But we certainly have that exterior appearance. And there are those who write us off as not the right people to be sharing this story because they don't think that we will do it appropriately. And there has been a little bit, I mean, as Star pointed out earlier this week, haters gonna hate. There's been a little bit of Facebook negativity about the events we're doing this weekend from people of color who essentially are saying, please don't, this is inappropriate. And I hate that. There's nothing you can do in the social media sphere in soundbite conversation that will effectively communicate the deliberateness that we're taking and the seriousness with which we take this project. And so there are those who just don't understand, I think, what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I hope that as the word gets out more, and as we continue to do the hard work, that we will win over some of those folks who remain skeptical that this is something we can do. But that's the criticism that has concerned me. But there hasn't been much of it, thankfully. Yeah. Y'all want to say anything to that? Do you want to say anything to that?
No, I would just be quiet.
Yeah, you're gonna get more pushback.
Yeah.
You'll get more. But that's okay. That's okay. That means you're doing something right. That means that you're going against the grain. You're doing something that has not yet been done at this site, which needs to be done, which should have been done all the time. And with that, you're going to get those who want to come in here and hear about this and this only. You're going to get folks who look like me, who are going, and you have gotten it, just spoke about it. There'll be more of that too. But just keep on. You know, I've been at this thing for 12 years, and I just know that you're going to get all that. So just be patient and keep going forward.
And then on the other side, have you gotten any encouragement, or has this sort of started something in Austin where other sites are looking at doing the same kind of thing?
So the question is, have we gotten any support for what we're doing, and are other sites looking at doing something similar? I'll speak to the second first, not so much about Austin, but what I will say is that there's this girl who came in a couple years ago, who was in the communication school, and she was doing a documentary-ish thing, screenplay. And she said she wanted to go someplace to learn about, she wanted to visit a place in Texas that would help her understand plantation life and sharecropping. And what site in Texas could I send her to? And I looked at her and I said, Louisiana? I mean, Texas has historically not taken on these topics in a place where you could actually go visit and see what's going on. In the meantime, both at Varner Hogg, which is run by the THC, and then ultimately down the road at Levi Jordan, which is run by the THC, both of which are in East Texas, they are doing very good work. And I do think, and this is only, did we decide this is your third or fourth trip to Texas? Fourth trip. He's been for 12 years traveling and has slept in over 150 slave dwellings. Texas is how big and how many enslaved people were here, and he's been here how many times? I think that says a lot about where we are as a state, but I do think that that's changing. And the more places you go, I actually go to a lot of historic sites, just by nature of my job, and the more places, the more frequently as I travel now, you're hearing the beginning of the stories. People are beginning, and it does take time. You don't just open your doors one day and say, hey, we've got this all figured out. It takes a lot of research and it takes thoughtfulness. So I think it's coming. There aren't a lot of historic sites in Austin left since we keep paving them over. What I will say is that what we hope from our standpoint is that by bringing attention to this structure, we can help others in Austin take a closer look at their own legacy businesses, at their homes. The city of Austin really needs to change the way in which they consider historic designation for structures. It's very much a dead white man's view of history. I mean, you gotta cross off the architect, it needs to be architecturally significant, somebody really important needs to live there. I mean, it's very hard to get historic status, whereas there are buildings still standing today where the stories, the people who lived there lived meaningful lives, and these structures should not be torn down and replaced by yet another condo. And so the more we can kind of share the value of these stories and the value of these places by leading with our own, we hope that we can help others in Austin do the same. That said, Six Square is excellent. The work that's being done at the Carver. There are various places in Austin that are doing really good work. It's just there aren't a ton of historic sites to work with.
Just following up on that, is anyone starting the work to even just mapping places that have been torn down, lost, but you do know the history and the contribution that made the building of Austin grow? So I mean, there are those stories. If it weren't for the people who were enslaved, we would have nothing. We'd be building now, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
As Joe's pointing out, we have this book, Reckoning with the Past, Slavery, Segregation, and Gentrification in Austin. It is a kind of a high-level view of some of the things that you're talking about. We start with our site, Tara and I. This was based on an exhibit that was on view actually in this room. When we took the exhibit down, we turned it into a book. Some of that is there. I mean, can you speak to, is anybody doing kind of a more, you've got a microphone.
Turn it on. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, you can. I think more, the Reckoning with the Past book and exhibit definitely provide a bigger contextual picture of that. And I would say that there are various entities who were looking at that, whether we're talking about from a more sort of
designation standpoint, the Texas Historical Commission and various members of their history staff are doing this kinds of thing. Even the city of Austin with certain things. Oakwood Cemetery and the chapel staff right now is doing some fantastic work on not just Black history, but history in Austin and identifying people and places who have been important to the past, the history's past. You have, various professors, including myself, Dr. Dinah Berry, in history, not specifically in Austin, but related to a lot of the research in Austin, but throughout Texas. We have Dr. Angia Roberts, who's back there in the hall somewhere, who I want to shout out, who is doing fantastic work on Texas freedom colonies and identifying those locales and their contributions to our history as well. It would be wonderful if we can figure out how to combine many of those efforts, because again, we have a lot of different efforts, whether it's professionals, academics, student work, communities who are doing that kind of research. But it is happening and it is ongoing, and there are lots of ways to find out about these untold and undertold stories of our city's history.
And when all that work is done, you're going to have to overlay it with the Native American presence in this area.
Yeah.
What is the result of what is the core, what is at the root of all of the criticism about you and this organization bringing all this forward and for doing the work that you're doing? I got here a little bit late, so if I missed that, I don't want you to repeat things, but what is so wrong about you being the organization that's bringing all this forward? You mentioned the Facebook, whatever the Facebook group said. Why are they so upset about you being the group that's bringing all of this forward?
Want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll try. Good afternoon, I'm Sharonda Robinson, and I have a communications firm and have had the honor of serving the Neill-Cochran House Museum as a client. And so we worked on If These Walls Could Talk, and now we're working on this project. I do a lot of work in the community as well, so I'll speak from a community member space. Sir, I think that part of what we experience as Black people is an internalization of racism. And I think Tara talked about it, the pain of telling the story of being in bondage and all the horror of enslavement is something that we don't want to look at because we haven't been taught to look at it through our public education system. And we don't have places like this that we can go to and share in the wisdom that Mr. Mcgill and Rowena and Tara, and apologies, I don't, Nell, are sharing with us. And so, there's a lot of work that we have to do internally, and a lot of work we have to do with our children and our systems to change narratives, and a lot of healing that we have to do in order to embrace that part of the story. We know it's not the full story, but we have never ever been directed in a holistic fashion at looking at slavery as an institution in terms of the economy and how the impact to people today. That's just not part of the American story. And so when you bring out this type of opportunity and you bring it to people who've been socialized in a way not to look at it, then it's only natural that kind of response happens. And so what you talked about going as a child, taking our kids to these spaces, bringing people storytelling, doing the storytelling that Jennifer Cumberbatch does, to make it a more human story. We've been so dehumanized, and we don't know how to address that as a community and have a conversation around that. So what you shared, Mr. Mcgill, about expect, when you're doing the good work, expect more. I was just like, okay, I'm gonna be doing this for a long time. it just hit me. But I feel like also that there are movements afoot, and Travis County just last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, COVID years, okay. Last year passed the African American Heritage Commission, and so there's a group of people and it's required by state law that a county track research and track and map the historical assets related to Black people. And so, and then you talked about Sixth Square. There's the W.H. Passon House, which has been around forever. There are lots of different disparate groups. Hello, Jennifer. So I felt you. Lots of different groups and lots of different people who are having this conversation, and now is the time to come together. I think because Rowena is white.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to lay that out because
that was a part of the reason. That's what I'm
right, because Rowena, and again, that goes back to, you know, this idea of telling the whole story and the whole truth. The reason I look like I do, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's a story behind that.
Yes.
And so, and because we've internalized, because it's hard to be in this body, you know, and to live and to be walking history.
Yes.
We don't have a way as I will say, Sharonda, as Black people to deal with that.
Thank you for being so thorough with
Yeah.
And just to follow up very briefly, if you weren't going to say it, I was going to say it. Because two of the specific comments that we've got, I mean, it's, well, one really, but it's almost the kind of how dare you. You know, that's the tone I got. And when we first started, and I think it was with around the Juneteenth activities, and so we were in the midst of the reckoning process exhibit, and someone had emailed Rowena and said, you know, all this is fine and dandy, and we appreciate what you're doing here, but don't you think you should have a Black historian or Black someone? And so, you know, I'm not the director of the Neill-Cochran House Museum, but her email back was, yes, we do have this professor who is working with us on this, but by the same token, Tara can't do everything. Right. Dr. Roberts can't do everything. And it's not for us to always have to do the work, do the labor, and tell the stories, which is why we need the allies and the other people in the community, not just the academics, the scholars. You know, we need our community organizations and the grassroots efforts to do this work as well. There are always going to be the naysayers and the people who just aren't willing to go behind the facade of the building or behind whatever historical wall or psychological wall or racial wall, whatever it is that is preventing that. There are always going to be those people, and we understand that, but we're going to continue to do the work. I think also with Juneteenth, someone was just like, oh, you shouldn't have a picnic, you know, and because of all the supposed negative connotations, what did I do? Negative connotations with that. But, you know, and, you know, all the myths that we kind of have about history. If you go back to the root word of the picnic, like, there's not really anything wrong with having a picnic. So we're going to have a picnic, just like we're also going to serve fried chicken tomorrow. Somebody messaged about that. I thought that was inappropriate. So seriously, and so those are some of the things that you can just kind of, you know, like Rowena said, shake the haters off. Other things you want to reply or respond to in a more concerted effort, because we want to understand people's concerns and the places and spaces that they're coming from as part of this work. But, you know, bottom line is because she's white.
And there is this thing called historical trauma, you know, that we have to deal with. You know, we don't want to talk about it because of the trauma involved. You talked about being in that body. You know, I talk often. I work at a plantation. I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and I get some. I hear some stuff. You know, and there are those who think, you know, that we've overcome. Why wake up that sleeping giant? Why scratch that itch? Or why open that wound? Let's just move on. You know, go get over it. We got those type of attitude. But some of those folks don't understand what it is. It is that baked in systemic racism that we have to understand. And we have to understand that even after emancipation, there were those efforts to continue to disenfranchise. You know, 1865 brought the end of that physical slavery. But we got to understand those things that replaced it, like the KKK and lynchings and convict labor and redlining and poll taxes and Jim Crow laws and black codes and massacres. All that stuff is wrapped up in all this. Yeah, we need to start there with the slave cabins and interpret that history, but we got to move beyond that and interpret those things that continue to disenfranchise us. So I think that, you know, that should be that some of that pushback that you give to those who think that we should be talking about this. We start there. That's only the start. We need to move from there and talk about these other things that continue to disenfranchise us. So there's that.
I would also say that we struggled with a name for this project, right? And what we settled on ultimately was Reckoning with the Past, which was the name of the original exhibit. The Untold Story of Race in Austin. We're calling that building the slave quarters because that's what it was, but it was only that briefly, which is not to say that those 10 years did not have great meaning. I don't mean it that way, but what I mean is that's a 10-year window of time followed by 85 years of site history in which that space remained a space for people who were free but were working here. And so we're sharing all of those eras. That this story, from our standpoint, does not end at 1865. It's part of a continuum, I guess is what I would say. Mcgill.
It was more of just a comment. I feel like a lot of people maybe in that Facebook arena may be feeling like they're doing their job in their community, because a lot of people are used to these sort of projects being in name only. And so I think that that's a different way to look at it, that even as these retorts come, a lot of them are coming from the right place. They may just be concerned, right? They may just see, hope to see more diverse people here, right? They may not know how they can be included, so they do what they think they can. And I think that that's a different perspective, because I don't think there are many people that don't see the value in coming to a peace and coming to a place of conversation, but a lot of people just are used to being sidelined and their voices being silenced and them being propped up as an image instead of, you know, a real substantive conversation.
I think you're right. Yes, you've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. I'm very concerned about the Gold Dollar House that's in this very neighborhood.
How much time you got?
It seems that the builder who purchased the property is abiding by the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law.
Right.
What's being done to preserve Jacob Fontaine's home?
He is still on that.
Well then, I'm glad you asked. So there have been various efforts in the city of the history of the city to preserve the building, okay? And so in 1976, when it was listed to the National Register, or 1977, at that time, there, you know, the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Register.
Tara, can you just stop for 1 second,
yes,
so that everybody knows what we're talking about?
Yes.
So the Fontaine building is a block away at 2402 St. Gabriel Street. It's currently surrounded by student housing, and it was the workplace, if not also the living space for Jacob Fontaine, who is arguably one of the most influential men of color to live in Austin in the 19th century. Now go on.
Thank you. That jumped in, and many people don't know what that place is or its significance. And I'll touch on that a little bit in my discussion/rant. And it was listed to the National Register, but at the time, for a bit of architectural significance, it was called the Franzetti Building, so named after the Italian-American family who had moved into Wheatville in the 1920s. It is part of that place. So even then, you know, so we have this initial level of erasure or ignoring that happens. Then in order to alleviate the fact that the approval, well, even before that, when you have another tenant, there was a bar/restaurant called Friedman's, and that renter of the space, because it wasn't the owner, it was the lessee, who was seeking to pay homage to Jacob Fontaine's legacy, his history. Fontaine had been brought to Austin by his enslaver, Edward Fontaine, who was important in St. David's Episcopal Church and other civic political contributions to the city of Austin. Jacob Fontaine became an important minister in Austin, established several Baptist churches in Wheatville, throughout Austin and Travis County in the area. He published what is thought to be the first African-American newspaper west of the Mississippi River at that site or adjacent to it. And so early on in Wheatville's history, he actually purchased the property at the corner of just a block away. So northwest corner of 24th and San Gabriel. And then at some point inhabited the Gold Dollar building, the Fontaine building, as a workplace and possibly dwelling, as Rowena said. But even that history and all of the particulars is rather recent, because the most recent threat, after the owner constructed this student housing around 3 sides of the building, basically horseshoeing it in. You can only barely see the facade. Every time I had to visit Rowena here, I would usually walk from campus and just literally wanted to cry when I saw what was going on. And then you could even see the facade with the construction, because there's the fence and all of the construction brouhaha happening. Well, the building gets built, and in an effort to mitigate that, the city made an effort, and it formally changed the name from the Franzetti building to the Jacob Fontaine Gold Dollar building. Okay, so we're recognizing that history, sort of ripping that Band-Aid off a little bit. Well, in January, as a neighbor who was within 500 feet of that building, Rowena gets a letter from the City of Austin Landmarks Commission saying that there's going to be a meeting of the Historic Landmark Commission because the current lessee wants to build a New Orleans style porch on the front of that building and tear down the existing structure. She messages me in our, kind of community, did you know about this? Hell no, I didn't know about this, kind of thing. And so we communicate to various people in the community and whatnot. Rowena went to that meeting, but they did table it because they started getting emails and phone calls about the situation, and then just seeking to understand, why is this wanting to happen? Do you even understand the structure of the building? What did the original balcony look like? And so myself, Dr. Ted Gordon at the university, and Charles Horn, who is a preservation architect and a graduate of the University of Texas, sought to do more research on the building, on its occupancy, because you get these things that have been repeated in, the secondary literature in the newspaper over and over and over again, so it becomes fact, right? So we weren't even sure, did Jacob Fontaine actually even live in that building? Like, that's a problem. What did it look like? Who lived there before? When was the 2-story porch added? When was it filled in? And so on and so forth. And so we did a bit more research, published information on a website that Dr. Gordon basically facilitates. Charles did some fantastic renderings and looking at Sanborn maps and other things in history that allowed us to understand that space a little bit more. And basically what we were saying is the current lessee, so yes, there was a 2-story balcony that was added sometime at the end of the 19th century. But we still don't know what it looks like, and more needs to be done to understand the construction of that building, the construction history, the physical fabric, and whatnot. And so Rowena and I and several others actually went to the next Landmarks Commission when it was back on the agenda to speak to that history. And then a couple of weeks later, and then they did not allow anything to move forward with the changes that the lessee was promoting to the building. And then I got an email a couple of weeks later saying that it had then been removed from the March agenda because they decided not to move forward as a result of that. So as is, the building was still there. And hopefully it stays that way, because it's the only building we have left, the only physical evidence of what Wheatville was, of that history. And as it is, it's been literally and figuratively obscured and hidden. And we only have that facade, which, even though it wasn't original to the structure, and there was probably no porch when Jacob Fontaine inhabited it, or it definitely didn't look like that. that part of the building is now part of the historic fabric. It's the thing that makes that building recognizable for what it is. And even if we were to have the enclosed porch reopened, which is what they were then proposing, we would still lose a certain amount of prominence that that building has because of the fact that there's all this other stuff now around that building. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I want to add to that is that, well, I'll add two things. One, thank God we're 500 feet away, less than 500 feet away, because if we had not been, none of us would have found out that this was happening, nor would we have had the ability to kind of rally the troops around it. The second thing that I would say about it is because of what's been done, this false front is the only thing that sticks out, because this god-awful, what I call disposable architecture that surrounds it, hits what was the front. And so you remove that and it just fades. It fades into the background. We have gone on a crazy length of time. It looks like we've got two. If we could do them, maybe try to do them quickly. I know we want to release everybody from this rather warm room. So you first and then Jen, and then we'll
Just
call
a
it.
quick question, kind of comment. I know it didn't pass. City of Austin was trying to do the code next so that you would not be notified even if you were within 500 feet.
Wow.
Is this building preserved from that? I mean, so nothing can happen.
Are we preserved?
I mean, no, that one.
Oh,
there.
Fontaine Building is a
It's protected.
landmark structure. It is protected. Any change has to go through the Historic Landmarks
And so
Commission.
anything around it, so you could petition anything like, or maybe obviously not. I mean, so if you own a property and someone sells it, they want to build something all around it as a property owner within 500 feet, you could protest that.
We can protest changes to the Fontaine Building because it's a historic landmark. We can't protest something that's going to go up next door to it.
Okay.
Yeah. Jen.
Now, I just wanted to momentarily return quickly to the question that was asked, why there's so much offense that you all, and I do want to emphasize, I don't want to throw those voices under the bus, because it's a reaction to not having ownership over our stories. And I think that the major difference in what we're trying to do here and what we tried to do with If These Walls Could Talk is to say that the colonial Danes have actually preserved the history, right? That would have otherwise gone the way of the Jacob Fontaine Building. And that the history of enslaved people and black people in this neighborhood is a part of the integrated history of this house and this neighborhood. They're not two separate entities. And so the whole point is to be inclusive in our storytelling. And you are taking the posture of saying, we're going to tell the whole story and not just the traditional story that's been told about this house, this neighborhood, and Wheatville. The whole story is our lives are incredibly integrated, and we have the right to tell the whole story. So that's
Thank
my
you. Thanks everybody. Thank you Tara, Nell, Joe. Thank you all for